reserves. So they're a really well organized, well, yes, we'll say that they're a well organized and very influential group that dictate the prices of oil. Just recently, Qatar left OPEC in January of 2019, and Ecuador has announced that they will leave. They were supposed to have left in January 2020. So right now they're down to the 5 Middle East countries, and that includes Western Asia as well, and then the 7 in Africa and 1 in South America. So I was finding it difficult to get whether or not Ecuador has actually left. So if you guys want to research that and let me know, that would be awesome. But yes, very influential group. And Saudi has given that they have the largest supply in reserve, they definitely have a huge impact on the price of oil, which has been occurring pretty recently. If you've been watching the news, the price of oil has really shot up. So not surprisingly, given the current climate. Oops. Not quite yet. All right, so I'll put the link to this. This is a video that goes through the events that have changed the world in terms of oil, and how, it gives you the history of the discovery. It also goes through the historical control and sort of how the industry has developed over time. So for sure, pause the video now. In fact, it's a good time because it's time for a break anyway. So if you want to pause the video and then go and find the link to that on slide 14, you'll find it there. Have a look at that, take notes on it, and then come back when you're ready and we'll continue. Okay. So, where am I? All right, so now we're getting on to the environmental impacts of oil, right? So there's many different ways in which just looking for oil can disrupt wildlife. So just the fact of exploration can also disrupt wildlife when you're building offshore rigs, when you're prospecting, when you're, out in the environment, digging wells, that can have a disruption on the wildlife. Oil spills, of course, are pretty dramatic events, and they can have many different ways in which they impact the environment. So we'll be going through some of these in greater detail. But oil spills, there can be the physical piece to oil spills, so just the smothering of animals and other wildlife. There's also chemical toxicity, which we'll talk about a little bit. There's also ecological changes. So when you have an oil spill, you can extirpate some species that will never rebound or never return. So the ecological structure of the environment can be altered. And on top of that, there's myriad other indirect consequences. And I've only listed 2 here, but they could go on for slides, and I'm sure you can think of more. But, loss of habitat can occur. You can lose entire coral reefs depending on where the oil spill is occurring. You can certainly have a decline in tourism, which will impact the economy. People aren't going to want to travel to areas that have been impacted by an oil spill, certainly. And there's also the environmental impacts of the end use of oil. So the actual consumption on a human anthropogenic basis, right? So you get emissions, so the carbon dioxide emissions from that, and the sulfur dioxide, and all other of those noxious chemicals that are part of just burning oil to create energy, has implications for climate change and light pollution. So when you think of all the lights in the world, right? I mean, there are hundreds, thousands, millions of lights that are on at night, and that creates some light pollution, and that in itself has myriad other ways that it impacts the ecological system. For organisms that actually rely on the moon for their navigation at night, for example, can be disrupted, like sea turtles when they first hatch. That can have an impact. So if we go through and we just talk a little bit about what oil really is, a spill is typically referred to crude oil spill. So it's the stuff that hasn't been refined. It hasn't gone through the refinery and changed it into different fractions and stuff like that. It's just the crude oil out from the ground. But oil itself, it's a hydrocarbon chain, and as you know, it's formed from the decomposition of organic material that existed millions of years ago. So it's the shells, the bones, the plant material that's been decomposed and creates oil. So crude is a synonym for unprocessed. And here is the chemical structure. You certainly don't need to memorize that, but it's just to give you an idea of what the hydrocarbon chain looks like. All right, so how oil reacts in the environment. I thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about this. So there are chemical and physical properties of hydrocarbons. So it'll depend on the kind of oil that has spilled, right, or that's been released into the environment. Density and viscosity are the two largest physical parameters that will dictate how the oil will respond once it gets into the environment. So obviously oil is less dense and will rise in seawater. When there's a spill out in the water, the oil will rise to the top. And obviously the viscosity of the oil impacts how readily and how far the oil will spread once it gets to the surface. So if you've got a really high viscosity, like, cold molasses, that would be something that's really highly viscous. That would spread much slower, right? But if you have something with low viscosity, let's say you warm up your honey and it flows really easily, that stuff will spread much faster, right? So those two things will impact how oil, once it gets into the environment, reacts. And evaporation is another piece to the puzzle as to how severe the oil spill can be. Much of the oil, of the crude oil, will, once it gets to the surface, it just evaporates off. It's highly volatile, meaning it will evaporate really quickly, and it creates air pollution above the ocean surface. And we'll talk a little bit more about evaporation when we get to some examples of oil spills here in a little bit. Okay, so there are natural oil seeps around the world, and they can be natural events. So you can have earthquakes or sometimes even a tsunami. Well, that's because you have an earthquake, but those events can trigger seepage from the ocean floor or even inland, depending on where those oil reserves are. So an example that you may have heard of here on the West Coast is the California Coal Point, and daily it releases almost 3,000 gallons of oil per day from a natural seep out in the ocean. So, there are definitely natural seeps in the Middle East as well. And in fact, if you look at this graph or the image here, the figure is showing you where you have those orange dots. Let me see if my pointer will work. There it is. So you've got these orange dots right here, and that's indicative of a hydrocarbon seep onshore. And whereas over here, this is where Coal Point is, where you have all these hydrocarbon seeps out on the marine edge. So certainly this isn't necessarily, an unnatural event to occur, which when we get to talk later on about how the ecosystem manages that, there's some examples of how organisms have pretty much adapted to break down the oil. Okay, so we're going to talk now a little bit about environmental disasters, a couple of examples that I can share with you. So the Gulf War oil spill in 1991. During the Gulf War, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, and as they were being driven out by coalition forces, they opened pipeline valves at the Sea Island oil terminal. And this spilled the oil onto the ground. There was cargo ships and tankers in the Persian Gulf that also had oil spills. And during their retreat, they set fires to the wells and pipeline terminals, and it was categorized now as the largest spill in history. So international it was an intentional spill to disrupt the war effort, right? So it was a huge disaster, estimated between, I know this is quite a large range, but between 2 and 11 million barrels of oil was suggested as being spilled, but it's almost impossible to really determine the total volume of oil spilled. But this is the best bet that scientists have. Still today, coastlines are being affected by the spill. I remember when I was in Dubai at this time, there was tar on the beaches constantly as a result of this spill. So it's still seen today. The marshes are still affected by the oil spill, and it will continue probably for decades. So if we take a look at what happened when the oil reached the Persian Gulf, you can see this circulation pattern. So in the Persian Gulf, we have, where's my cursor? There it is. We have freshwater input from the rivers coming down here. And of course, freshwater is less dense than seawater. So the freshwater, where's my cursor gone? Oh, there it is. Sorry. The fresh water ends up being a lens of water that sits on top, and it floats on the surface and is moved down the west bank of the Persian Gulf towards the United Arab Emirates, and then back out through here. And water that's entering in, because it's a tidally influenced basin, so you're getting, where's my cursor gone again? You're getting the salt water enter in this way, and salt water is more dense and will sink, and then, I'm sorry, I keep losing my cursor, and then sweeps up the east side near Iran and at depth, and then continues to mix with the fresh water. So you can see there's this sort of circular motion, and the dark areas indicated on this map are showing you where there was heavy oil that was in during the time of the spill, and moderate areas through here. And so the oil spill occurred right here, and as a result of circulation, the water was moving this oil around as well, as the tides were influencing and all of that. So another thing to think about is that in this region, evaporation exceeds water input. So that had a big factor to play in how the oil spill impacted the area. So it's estimated that a lot of the oil during this oil spill did actually evaporate. One of the ways that once the oil spill had occurred, that they tried to reduce the impact was to use smart bombs. So coalition forces were able to seal the open pipelines at the Al Mahdi facility, and that reduced the flow of the oil, at least then. And American and Dutch workers also built ponds in the desert to store all of that spilling oil so that they could try to recover it from being spilled. They also used booms and skimmers that were used to surround the areas that were impacted, especially near their desalination plants. So they were trying to protect the inflow of water during desalination at that time.